How the Caribbean could ditch the US dollar forever. For decades, the Caribbean has been bound by invisible chains, not made of iron, but of finance. Every time a Jamaican exporter ships goods to Trinidad, or a Barbadian hotelier pays a supplier in the Bahamas, money doesn't flow directly between those nations. Instead, it takes a detour through New York, gets converted into US dollars, and then trickles back down. This dependency has been so ingrained that most people never question it. But now, a quiet movement is underway to change the game forever. For central banks, from Barbados to the Bahamas, Eastern Caribbean, and another soon-to-be-announced Caricom member, are testing a brand new system called the Caricom Payment and Settlement System, or CAPSS. This platform could allow Caribbean nations to trade and send money directly in their own currencies, without the US dollar as the middleman. It's not just a technical upgrade, it's a statement of financial independence. If successful, CAPSS could alter the balance of power in Caribbean trade, reduce costs for businesses, and weaken one of Washington's strongest levers over the region. And while officials are presenting it as a practical tool for efficiency, make no mistake, this is about sovereignty, strategy, and the future of economic freedom in the Caribbean. How the US dollar came to rule the Caribbean. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II, when the US dollar became the global standard for trade. In the Caribbean, newly independent nations inherited financial systems designed during the colonial era, systems that depended heavily on foreign currencies, first the British pound, and later the American dollar. By the late 20th century, nearly all cross-border trade in the region had to be settled in US dollars. This dominance was reinforced by the correspondent banking system, where local Caribbean banks partner with bigger foreign banks, usually in the US, to access the global payment network. That meant if you wanted to send money from Grenada to St. Kitts, your payment had to pass through an American bank first. While efficient in some ways, it gave the US enormous control over the region's access to global finance. The arrangement worked until recent years, when US banks began de-risking, cutting ties with smaller Caribbean institutions to avoid the costs and risks of complying with strict anti-money laundering rules. Suddenly, some islands found themselves one decision away from being cut off from the global economy. That vulnerability planted the seeds for an alternative, and CAPSS is the answer taking root. The human cost of dollar dependence. For small business owners, the US dollar chokehold means higher costs and slower payments. Imagine running a restaurant in Antigua and buying produce from a farmer in Dominica. The payment has to be converted into US dollars, routed through a New York bank, and then sent back into Eastern Caribbean dollars. That process adds days of delay and multiple layers of fees. For families, the pain is even more personal. The Caribbean is one of the most remittance-dependent regions in the world, with billions sent each year from relatives working in the US, Canada, and the UK. Those remittances often pass through expensive money transfer companies that charge hefty percentages, costs that eat into what loved ones receive. In a system where even small amounts are taxed by intermediaries, financial dependency isn't just an economic problem, it's a social one. By keeping the US dollar at the center of every transaction, the current model also drains local foreign exchange reserves. Central banks must constantly hold large dollar reserves to facilitate trade, meaning that valuable resources are tied up instead of being invested in local development. CAPSS aims to release that pressure. How CAPSS works. CAPSS is designed to let Caribbean nations trade and transfer funds directly in their own currencies. Here's how it works. Say a shop in Barbados wants to pay a supplier in the Bahamas. Instead of both parties converting into US dollars, the payment is made in Barbadian dollars, and the system instantly converts it into Bahamian dollars. Settlement happens in real time between the two central banks. The system is modeled partly after Africa's Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, which launched in 2022 and has already allowed African nations to reduce their reliance on the dollar for cross-border trade. CAPSS could eventually connect with PAPSS, creating a direct bridge between Africa and the Caribbean, a connection with historical, cultural, and economic significance. Initially, CAPSS will operate among the 4 pilot countries, but the vision is for all Caricom members to join. The more countries on the network, the more powerful it becomes, and the less the US dollar is needed for regional trade. Benefits beyond money. The most obvious benefit of CAPSS is reduced transaction costs, but the ripple effects go deeper. Faster, cheaper payments mean regional businesses can operate more efficiently, which in turn strengthens local economies. Micro and small enterprises, often locked out of international trade due to high banking costs, could suddenly find it viable to expand beyond their own islands. By keeping trade within local currencies, CAPSS also promotes currency stability. More demand for Eastern Caribbean dollars, Barbadian dollars, or Bahamian dollars in regional trade could make them more resilient against external shocks. That, in turn, boosts investor confidence and encourages more intra-Caribbean investment. Beyond economics, there's the symbolic power of financial self-reliance. For a region with a long history of colonial dependency, the ability to settle its own trade without going through foreign intermediaries is a step toward genuine sovereignty and a message to the world that the Caribbean can set its own terms. The risks and obstacles. Despite the promise, CAPSS faces serious challenges. The US dollar isn't just dominant, it's deeply entrenched in the global financial system. Reducing its role will take time, trust, and flawless execution. Any major technical failure in CAPSS could damage confidence and slow adoption. There's also the risk of political pressure. Washington may not openly oppose CAPSS, but it could quietly influence banks and international institutions to limit cooperation, especially if the system is seen as undermining US influence. The IMF and World Bank, which often work closely with Caribbean economies, may also raise concerns about stability and compliance. Finally, adoption depends on national will. Some Caribbean nations may hesitate, fearing potential backlash or disruption to their established banking relationships. For CAPSS to succeed, it will need a united front, and in a region where politics can be fractious, unity is easier said than done. What happens if it succeeds? If CAPSS works as planned and more countries join, the Caribbean could reach a point where most regional trade no longer touches the US dollar. Local currencies would become more widely used and respected, and foreign exchange reserves could be freed up for domestic investment. Businesses would save millions in fees, and remittances could arrive in minutes instead of days. The strategic impact would be huge. By linking directly with Africa's PAPSS, the Caribbean could bypass the dollar not just for regional trade, but for intercontinental commerce. This would open new markets and investment flows without the financial gatekeeping of US banks. For the first time in modern history, the Caribbean could stand on its own financial legs, not fully disconnected from the global system, but no longer chained to it. That's a vision that excites economists and worries geopolitical power brokers in equal measure. The road ahead. The CAPSS pilot is still in its early days, and the road to full implementation will be long. There will be technical trials, political negotiations, and intense scrutiny from the global financial community. But the fact that 4 central banks are willing to take the leap shows a growing appetite for change. If momentum builds, we could be looking at the beginning of a regional payment revolution, one that mirrors similar moves in Africa, Asia, and South America, where countries are seeking to de-dollarize parts of their economies. The question is not whether the Caribbean needs an alternative, but whether it has the unity and determination to make it work. In the end, CAPSS isn't just about money. It's about dignity, independence, and control. If the Caribbean succeeds in ditching the US dollar for its own trade, it will have rewritten the rules of engagement in the global economy forever.